Are you tired of spending your child's college fund on a new graphics card? Do you hate the hurt look your wallet gives you after you indulge in the latest tech? Then clearly an addiction is what you need. Have too much free space? Fill it with Clearly an Addiction. Already have a decent personal computer? Build another with Clearly an Addiction. For the low price of free plus the cost of purchasing components, you too can have Clearly an Addiction.
Clearly an Addiction is not responsible for any loss of personal life, healthy relationships, vitamin D, or bankruptcy. Clearly an Addiction has been known to cause social isolation, harmful levels of stress, and increased suicidal thoughts in children, teen, and adults. Do not use Clearly an Addiction while operating heavy machinery. Consult your parents before getting Clearly an Addiction.
You might call me a liar when I say that I can regularly source used parts for about 50% of their value. I wouldn't blame you because there is a plethora of content here on YouTube where the creator will use some ridiculous deal that they got through unfair means to achieve these goals. The process I'm going to explain in this video isn't some quick hack or cheat to get you cheap computer components, but it is a realistic way of approaching this problem and achieving that goal. To show exactly what you can expect, I'm going to be using this deal that I picked up on Facebook Marketplace as an example throughout this video. The deal that I picked up is this system that I purchased for $400. Looking at the description of the ad, you can figure out the CPU, the GPU, the SSD, the hard drive, and the RAM. Looking at the pictures of the ad, you can figure out the motherboard, the AIO, the case, and the extra fans that were put in. So after all of that, the only item that we don't know in this computer is the power supply, but you can roughly kind of assume what type of power supply is in a system based off of the other components that are in there. But why do we need to list out all of the components in the system that we're buying? The reason we do this is whenever you're doing this process to try and source cheap parts, you want to know roughly the value of all of the components that make up the build. So taking that list that we just acquired and going online, you can start researching the used value for each of these components. If you don't know how to do that or how I do it, here is a video that I've done before on what used components are worth and how to figure that one out. But how do we take that entire used value and figure out what we paid for each component inside? That's where a bit of math comes in. So going off of our example, one thing that I'm going to mention is it also came with a monitor and a keyboard and a mouse, which I can very easily sell for about $60 US. So that leaves us with paying $340 for the entirety of this system. Doing our research online, the entire used value of this system is about $675. It might move up and down here and there a little bit, especially with the GPU market the way it is right now, but as long as you have a ballpark number to work with, this process is still rather effective. But how do we take those numbers and figure out what we precisely paid, for example, the GPU? This is a good example for anyone that might buy a system and only interested in buying the GPU, or buying a system and only interested in one or two parts inside of it. So to give you an example for the formula that I use, we're going to be using this GTX 970. If you take the used value of the GTX 970 and figure out the percentage that makes up of the entire system's used value, so in this case the GTX is worth $125 and the entire system's value is $675, that's roughly 18% of that entire used value. So we take that 18% and then we apply it to the $360 we paid for the system, ultimately leaving us with $63 that we paid for this GTX 970. What this effectively does is allows you to figure out what you paid for each component in the computer based off of their relative value. You wouldn't want, for example, this GTX 970 is worth more than the Ryzen 5 1400 in this system, and so they should be valued differently when trying to figure out how much you paid for them. But that is a perfect example for about the 50% mark that I hit, where we paid $63 for the GPU and it's roughly worth about $125. But now go into the scenario where someone might only want the GPU and would want the cheap price that they got for buying the whole system. You're now going to be tasked with selling the rest of the system. And I'm not going to say that that is easy or it's effortless, and that is one of the main reasons that not everyone goes about getting parts in this manner. This type of situation works perfectly for what I do. I'm constantly flipping computers and I have multiple projects going on, and I might take a few parts from one build or one purchase and move them into another project. So figuring out all of the various values I paid for them and then applying them in other scenarios where I'm also going to be flipping the computer and making money ultimately keeps my inventory full and allows me to source parts for about 50% their value. You might say that it's pretty impossible or not exactly standard to find these deals where you're paying about 50% of what the total system is worth. I'd argue it's a lot more achievable than what most people would think. Really, what you have to do is buy some of the posts that not everyone would immediately go for. It might be a bit dirty, it might be kind of old, it might have parts that people don't really want but have a few kind of golden nuggets in it, or it might just be very poorly advertised. You might have to do a little bit of digging, and that's precisely kind of where the end of my advice is going to wrap up in this video. This avenue or this process is not for everybody. There is no easy way to simply just pay 50% for parts that you want, especially if you're somebody who's very used to just clicking a few buttons on Amazon and then having the components show up at your door. This is way more involved than that, and you might value your time or your efforts or your intellect more than the time it would take to go through this process. But if you're somebody who's interested in computers and find yourself tinkering with them rather regularly, or if you're flipping computers as a hobby or a business or somewhere in that range, then this is a really decent and steady way of keeping your inventory up and keeping your prices low, so then hopefully you can pass the savings on to your customers and not just try and line your own dirty little pockets. But that is one thing I want to make abundantly clear, is this isn't some cheap, easy, get-rich-quick scheme. This is just one way of doing it that is, at least if you know what you're doing or if you've done it effectively a couple times, a steady way of keeping cheap computer components flowing through your system. Now, if you want more examples of what this looks like, at least in my situation, here are a bunch of spreadsheets that are the various purchases I have made for the last month and breaking down their value and the parts and what I paid for each and all that fun stuff. Basically the same process we went through with this system here. But that should give you a pretty good spread of what I usually get. Not every purchase I make is 50%. Sometimes it's a much slimmer ratio, but overall, that's kind of the mark I try to aim for. But with my advice bestowed upon you and my various disclaimers sprinkled on the end, that basically wraps up this video. I hope that it was somewhat informative for you, and maybe it gave you all a couple ideas on how to potentially get a bit more performance out of the dollars that you spend on these components. But that will bring us to the end of today's video. If you learned something new or you just like the sweet sound of my voice, then hit that like button. If you thought that I was annoying and rambled way too much, then hit that dislike button. If you want to see more of my PC flipping adventures or whatever strange content ends up on this channel, then consider hitting that subscribe button. But without further ado, have a good day, guys.